There's a symbol you've likely seen your entire life without ever questioning its origin. A single eye floating atop a pyramid imprinted on every U.S. dollar bill. For many, it's just an artistic detail, but for others, it's a silent clue pointing to an age-old secret society said to have influenced history from the shadows. The Freemasons. Some even claim that 15 U.S. presidents were part of this brotherhood, hinting at a deep-rooted connection between political power and hidden agendas. But this mystery isn't just the subject of conspiracy theories or fiction. It forms the basis of a story passed down through generations, one that blurs the lines between myth and historical detail. For young Benjamin Gates, it all began with a book, an old, dusty volume tucked away in his grandfather's study. One day, drawn by a restless curiosity, Ben went through boxes, papers, and forgotten corners until he stumbled upon that book. Just as he was about to open it, his grandfather walked in. But instead of scolding him, he did something unexpected. He sat Ben down and began to speak, not about punishment, but about legacy, their family's legacy. He spoke of Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, who in 1832, on his deathbed, was desperate to pass on a secret he had kept hidden for decades. The man chosen to carry this burden wasn't a politician or soldier, but his stable hand, Thomas Gates, Ben's ancestor. Charles Carroll's secret was nothing, less than the existence of a treasure, not any ordinary fortune, but one of unimaginable magnitude. This treasure, he said, had fueled empires, provoked wars, and traveled from civilization to civilization, growing with each transfer until it vanished from history. According to the legend, it was rediscovered over 1,000 years later beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem by a group of crusading knights. Realizing its immense value, they decided it couldn't belong to a single man, or even a monarch. They smuggled it out of the Holy Land and created a secret order to protect it, the Knights Templar. For centuries, the Templars kept the treasure hidden, eventually transforming into a new society, the Freemasons. As time passed, their network expanded across Europe and eventually reached the American colonies. Members included prominent historical figures like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. When the American Revolution broke out, the Freemasons feared the treasure might fall into British hands. So they did what they had to. They hid it. But not without leaving behind cryptic clues, coded messages, hidden symbols, and maps scattered across documents and monuments. Most of these clues were lost to time, but one remained. It was this final fragment of the puzzle that Carroll whispered to Thomas Gates. The secret lies with Charlotte. No one ever knew exactly who or what Charlotte was. Even Carroll didn't. The Freemasons never gave direct answers. Only riddles hidden in plain sight. And since we're uncovering ancient secrets together, let me share a small goal from the present. This channel is aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers by June 30th. If you're enjoying stories like this one, your subscription would mean a lot. Now, let's keep going. Ben's curiosity didn't fade with childhood. It only deepened. 30 years after that pivotal conversation with his grandfather, he was still chasing the mystery. Now, an expert in history and symbology, Ben found himself in the frozen reaches of the Arctic, driven by a singular belief that the next piece of the puzzle was hidden beneath the ice. He wasn't alone. With him were Riley Poole, a tech wizard and loyal friend, and Ian Howe, a wealthy investor with his own motives. Ian had provided the funding, but his men were armed, impatient, and clearly more interested in the loot than the legacy. When they reached the location marked on an ancient map, they found nothing but snow and silence. Yet Ben was undeterred. Guided by intuition, he began digging. Soon his shovel struck something solid. Brushing away the ice revealed a corroded metal plaque. Pouring warm water over it, Ben uncovered a name, Charlotte. The revelation electrified the team. With renewed energy, they cleared the area until the contours of an old ship emerged from beneath the snow, a colonial vessel buried in ice. Ben had found Charlotte, but this wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. Inside the ship's dark, frozen hold, the truth waited. Not just about the treasure, but about the lengths men would go to claim it. Inside the wreck of the Charlotte, the team descended cautiously. What they hoped to find was gold or artifacts, but what they discovered was something far stranger. Dusty barrels filled with black powder, brittle crates long since collapsed, and amid the decay, a skeleton clinging tightly to one of the barrels, frozen in a final desperate embrace. Why would a captain die, holding onto a keg of gunpowder? Ben searched further and discovered a small package, a box containing a meerschaum pipe, intricately carved and surprisingly well preserved. On closer inspection, he noticed an inscription. As the others watched impatiently, Ben disassembled the pipe, applied a drop of his own blood to its stem, and rolled it over a parchment. Letters slowly appeared, a hidden message. It read, "The legend written, the key in silence kept, the 55 will not offend Mr. Matlack." Riley's eyes widened. Matlack had been the official scribe of the Declaration of Independence. The 55? A reference to its signers. The pieces came together with alarming clarity. A hidden map, likely drawn in invisible ink, concealed on the back of America's most important historical document. Ian's excitement turned to calculation. His ambition was clear. He would steal the Declaration to uncover the map. Ben, appalled, tried to stop him. But for Ian, Ben was no longer a partner, but an obstacle. His men pulled guns. Thinking fast, Ben lit a flare and hurled it toward the gunpowder. The resulting explosion rocked the ice. As the ship burst into flames, Ian and his men fled, assuming Ben and Riley were dead. But they weren't. They survived, and now had a new mission: protect the Declaration before someone else could exploit it. Shaken but alive, Ben and Riley made their way back to Washington, D.C. They had no proof, only a theory that sounded absurd to anyone unfamiliar with their journey. But Ben knew what was at stake. The Declaration of Independence, that sacred document, might hold the final clue to a treasure buried for centuries. Their first move was to contact the authorities. They approached the FBI requesting to speak to someone about a potential threat to national security. But without evidence, they were dismissed almost immediately. Frustrated but undeterred, Ben and Riley turned their attention to the National Archives, the current home of the Declaration. There they encountered Dr. Abigail Chase, a historian responsible for the document's care. Ben tried to explain the situation. "Someone's planning to steal the Declaration of Independence," he said, his voice low but intense. Abigail laughed. "You do realize how ridiculous that sounds, right? It's protected by bulletproof glass, motion sensors, heat detectors, and is lowered into a vault each night." The skepticism was expected, but time was running out. As they left the building, Ben noticed a brochure in the lobby. A gala was scheduled for that weekend, an event that would offer unprecedented access to the archives. In that moment, a decision crystallized in Ben's mind. If no one else would protect the Declaration, he would. Even if it meant doing the unthinkable, stealing it himself. Planning the heist was a meticulous affair. Ben and Riley studied the archive's layout, its rotating security shifts, and every inch of the building's design. While the main exhibit was a fortress, they discovered a vulnerability: the restoration room. Documents were occasionally moved there for conservation work, and the security was less intense. Coincidentally, during the gala, a security test would trigger a false alarm, prompting guards to move the Declaration to that very room. It was their only chance. Riley used a handheld laser to activate the sensors prematurely, tricking the system into relocating the document. On the night of the event, Ben disguised himself as a janitor to slip inside, later revealing a tuxedo beneath to blend in with the guests. He greeted Abigail with confidence, offered her champagne, and carefully lifted her fingerprints from the glass. The final piece needed to access the restoration room, but they weren't alone. Ian and his mercenaries had infiltrated the building through the sewers. While Ben maneuvered through the corridors, Ian's team dismantled locks, neutralized guards, and closed in fast. Ben reached the restoration room, Just in time, retrieved the declaration and headed toward the elevator. Then he heard footsteps. Ian's men. They opened fire. Ben ducked behind a column, heart pounding, and slipped the document into a souvenir tube. Making a narrow escape through the gift shop, he paid for a replica to avoid suspicion. But as he stepped outside, he wasn't alone. Abigail had followed him. She had questions, and Ben had no time to answer. Outside the National Archives, Ben's escape seemed short-lived. Abigail, sharp and persistent, blocked his path and demanded an explanation. Before he could respond, alarms blared inside the building. The heist had been discovered. Abigail's suspicion turned into disbelief as she realized Ben hadn't stolen a replica. He had the real Declaration of Independence. Just then, Ian and his men intercepted them. Abigail, refusing to give up the document, was forced into their vehicle. Ben hesitated for only a second before jumping into his car and giving chase. In a high-stakes maneuver, he intercepted Ian's van, rescuing Abigail and reclaiming the scroll. Back in a safe location, Abigail's outrage finally spilled over. "What is this? What are you really after?" Ben explained everything: the pipe, the coded message, the possible invisible map, and Ian's intent to exploit history for profit. As absurd as it all sounded, the evidence was overwhelming. Abigail, a devoted scholar, couldn't ignore it. With a reluctant nod, she agreed to help. Meanwhile, Ian, realizing he had been duped into stealing a fake, intensified his search. Back at the archives, Agent Sadusky began his investigation. Reviewing surveillance footage, he noticed something odd: a man attempting to purchase a souvenir replica of the Declaration, paying with a credit card. A name appeared on the receipt: Benjamin Gates. With the clock ticking, the chase was on. Knowing they couldn't decode the clue without one crucial element, Ben and his team sought out the letters of silence. Do Good, a series of satirical essays written under a pseudonym by Benjamin Franklin. These letters were rumored to hold the key to interpreting the Ottendorf cipher described in the pipe's message. Unfortunately, the original manuscripts had been donated to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. With Ian now actively hunting them, Ben, Riley, and Abigail raced there first. Their plan was simple: send a child inside to retrieve clues without drawing attention. The boy moved quickly between the display cases, whispering letter and number combinations to Riley, who decoded the cipher piece by piece. Each segment unveiled more of the map's riddle. The vision to seek the ancient treasure appears when the shadow crosses the House of Peace. But one last word was missing. Ian, always watching, grew suspicious when he noticed a child fixated on the Do Good display. Realizing too late that the boy had uncovered something vital, he moved in. Riley barely escaped, relaying the final word to Ben and Abigail. It was Stow. Ben made the connection instantly. Peace and Stow. Words engraved on the Liberty Bell. With the full riddle now solved, the next location pointed not to a place, but to a moment. The exact time the shadow would fall across a monument. Ben looked at a $100 bill, saw the depiction of Independence Hall, and noted the time on its clock tower: 2:22. With barely minutes to spare, they raced toward the building to catch the shadow before it vanished. Arriving at Independence Hall with only moments to spare, Ben, Abigail, and Riley took their positions as the shadow slowly crept across the historic courtyard. Time seemed suspended as they waited for it to align precisely. At 2:22 p.m., the sunlight cast a long shadow over the lawn, stretching to a specific point on the ground. There, embedded in the soil, was a weathered brick with a faint engraving. Ben dropped to his knees, brushing away dirt and debris to reveal a small, hand-carved symbol. Carefully, removing the brick, he uncovered a compartment housing an unusual pair of spectacles. Not ordinary glasses, but an invention with multiple lenses of different colors, clearly designed by Benjamin Franklin himself. With the Declaration of Independence unrolled on a nearby table, Ben peered through the layered lenses. New text began to emerge on the back of the document, phrases only visible through specific color filters. One phrase stood out: "Here at the wall." But something was off. The word Here had 3S, a deliberate distortion. Before they could investigate further, Ian and his men appeared once again, guns drawn. They seized the declaration and demanded the spectacles. Ben hesitated but had no choice. Ian took everything. Then, as if fate added insult to injury, the FBI arrived. Amid the chaos, Ben was taken into custody while Ian disappeared into the city. But even behind bars, Ben refused to give up. He knew the game wasn't over. Not yet. At the FBI office, Agent Sadusky began his interrogation. He listened to Ben's story with a measured skepticism. Templars, Masons, hidden maps. It sounded like fiction. But Sadusky, a man who had seen strange things in his career, wasn't so quick to dismiss it all. As he examined the special lenses confiscated from Ben, he noticed how the filters worked, revealing different messages with each colored layer. One sentence had been partially revealed earlier, but Sadusky saw more. Hidden beneath the ink was an even deeper message. Realizing this, Ben leaned forward. There's still time. Ian will make a mistake, and I know where he's going. Just then, Ben received a call from Ian. He proposed a trade, Ben's insight for the return of the Declaration and the Meerschaum pipe. Surprisingly, Sadusky agreed to the deal. With a plan forming, Ben met Ian's men at a secluded waterfront. But it wasn't what it seemed. One of the mercenaries whispered that Abigail had made a deal to help Ben escape. The instructions were clear. Jump into the river. Without hesitation, Ben dove into the dark water and swam to safety. Reunited with Abigail and Riley, the team worked quickly to interpret the final clue. Here at the wall, Ben recalled an old colonial wall that once stood where Wall Street now exists. In the 17th century, Dutch settlers had built it as a defensive barrier. The triple E in Hiri was a deliberate reference to a colonial-era street sign. That clue pointed to the exact location where Broadway and Wall Street intersected, and to something even older hidden nearby. If you've made it this far, chances are you're just as hooked as we are. So take a second to like the video and follow the channel. That way, you won't miss the next story we're preparing. Trust me, there's a lot more coming. With the coordinates narrowed down to the corner of Wall Street and Broadway, Ben, Abigail, and Riley moved fast. But Ian was already anticipating their next move, as Ben tried to slip away after. Sharing what he knew, Ian stepped in and revealed his hand. He had captured Riley, Abigail, and even Ben's father, Patrick. If Ben withheld anything, they would suffer the consequences. Under pressure, Ben revealed one final detail. The clue didn't stop at Wall Street. It led to Trinity Church, a centuries-old chapel standing right beside their location. Once inside, they unrolled the declaration again and viewed it through the special lenses. A new message emerged, this time hidden beneath the printed ink, directing them to a passage under Parkington Lane. While it sounded like a street, Ben knew better. "It's not a street," he said. "It's a crypt." In the quiet, dusty halls beneath the church, they found the tomb of Parkington Lane. Pushing it open revealed a descending tunnel, narrow and dark. They climbed down into the catacombs, following a path that twisted through the foundations of the city. Finally, they reached a crude freight elevator, a sign that whatever lay below was once accessed regularly and was important. With each foot they dropped, tension climbed. The air grew colder. The walls moaned with the weight of centuries. When they finally landed at the bottom, their hearts raced. But to their dismay, the chamber was empty. No gold, no relics, nothing but an old lantern. Ian's face hardened. "You're hiding something." And now he was willing to leave them there to rot if Ben didn't speak. Ben remained calm even as Ian prepared to ascend without them. Patrick, seeing his son cornered, stepped forward and redirected Ian's focus. "The lantern," he said, voice steady. "It's the final clue." He explained the historical reference, how during the American Revolution, Paul Revere had used a lantern in the steeple of Old North Church in Boston to warn of the British invasion. "One if by land, two if by sea," Patrick quoted, referencing the famous signal. Ian, intrigued, accepted the explanation, nodded to his men, and started back up the elevator. But it was a trap. Ben and Patrick needed Ian out of the way. Alone in the chamber, they examined the lantern more closely and noticed a hollow compartment at its base. Pressing gently, they triggered a hidden mechanism. A panel on the stone wall shifted. Behind it, a tunnel snaked deeper underground. They followed the path, moving past dust-covered beams and half-rotted planks. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into a grand stone hall. Their breath caught. The walls were lined with relics. Sarcophagi from Egypt, Roman busts, Greek scrolls, Crusader gold. The treasure wasn't a myth. It was real. An overwhelming mix of awe and reverence filled the air. But Ben wasn't thinking about wealth. He called Sadusky. "We found it," he said simply. When the FBI arrived, Ben handed over the declaration and the location of the treasure. His only request? That it be preserved and shared with the world. Sadusky, moved by Ben's integrity, agreed, and in a final gesture of trust, he revealed a ring bearing the Masonic emblem. The Brotherhood had been watching, and Ben had proven himself worthy. News of the treasure's discovery spread like wildfire, but true to Ben's word, it was never exploited. Instead, it was cataloged and distributed to museums around the world, in Cairo, Paris, London, and New York, so that humanity, not any one nation or person, could benefit from it. Ben and Riley declined any personal reward, but the government insisted on a small token of appreciation. Riley, always dreaming big, purchased a top-of-the-line sports car. Ben, ever the romantic, bought an old estate with colonial architecture reminiscent of the founding era, a quiet place where history whispered through the walls. But beyond the physical rewards, something more profound had changed. Ben's actions had vindicated a family legacy long dismissed as fantasy. For 6 generations, the Gates name had been mocked for chasing shadows. Now, it stood for perseverance, truth, and the courage to protect something greater than oneself. Abigail, having witnessed every step of the journey, chose to stay close to Ben. Their bond, forged under pressure and sustained by mutual respect, blossomed into something deeper. Together, they began to research the connections between historical myth and reality, dedicating themselves to uncovering stories that had been hidden, lost, or distorted. As for Agent Sadusky, he remained a quiet presence, though he never confirmed how much he knew from the beginning. His Masonic ring spoke volumes. Whether he was watching out of duty or belief, one thing was certain. Ben had passed a test not just of intellect, but of integrity, and that had earned him something far more valuable than gold. Though the treasure had been found and justice had been served, with Ian arrested and his accomplices exposed, questions still lingered in the minds of many. Were the Freemasons truly guardians of knowledge, or were they manipulators of power? The public, caught between history and hearsay, continued to speculate. The truth, as Ben often said, wasn't so black and white. The Freemasons were not a monolithic force pulling strings from behind the curtain. Rather, they were a fraternity of thinkers, builders, philosophers, and visionaries, men who, in their time, dared to challenge the status quo. They used symbols not to deceive, but to teach. Their secrecy was not about exclusion, but protection, preserving ideas that could not safely be voiced in oppressive eras. Still, in the shadowy corners of the internet, conspiracies thrived. Some claimed their grandfathers had been Masons and had witnessed dark rituals. Others insisted the Brotherhood was tied to demons, aliens, or global control. But none of these claims were backed by concrete evidence, only stories told with fear, passion, and mystery. Ben understood that history itself is a battleground. People pick fragments of the past and build narratives that suit their fears or fantasies. But the real challenge lies in approaching history with curiosity, not suspicion, with the desire to understand, not condemn. For Ben, the treasure was never the gold. It was the clarity that came from peeling back the layers of myth to find what was real. That was the true inheritance of the Gates family, and the real legacy of the Freemasons. As the dust settled, Ben found himself in quiet reflection more often than ever before. The chaos had passed, but the impact lingered. Often returned to the hidden chamber, now secured and converted into a historical site, not for its value in gold, but for what it represented: centuries of accumulated human achievement, preserved and passed on like a message in a bottle across time. One evening, standing beneath the vaulted stone ceiling with torchlight flickering across ancient artifacts, Ben finally grasped what his grandfather had tried to teach him all those years ago. It wasn't about proving something to the world or even to his family. It was about living with purpose, the kind of purpose that defies doubt, ridicule, or even failure. That purpose had taken him to the edge of the world, into the belly of myths, and out the other side with a truth no one could deny. As he looked around, he didn't see treasure. He saw the work of generations. Scribes, architects, artists, and warriors who had dared to believe their culture was worth preserving. It reminded him that the pursuit of truth often feels like madness until you find it. Only then does it become history. Back home, Patrick, once skeptical, looked at his son with pride. The arguments, the tension, the warnings, all of it had faded. In its place stood a bond forged in truth and renewed by courage. "You did good, Ben," he finally said. It was the only validation Ben ever really needed. Meanwhile, Abigail and Riley continued to grow into their roles as partners, not just in adventure, but in research and purpose. Riley, ever the tech genius, wrote a book chronicling their discovery with a bit of flair, naturally. The title? "The Templar Treasure Was Real and I Was There." It became a surprise bestseller, capturing the imagination of a generation hungry for stories that blurred the line between legend and fact. Abigail, on the other hand, began curating exhibits focused on the philosophical roots of Freemasonry, exploring not the conspiracies, but the ideals that once inspired men to form secret societies in pursuit of enlightenment. She spoke at universities, museums, and historical forums, always emphasizing one truth: secrecy does not always hide evil. Sometimes it shelters ideas waiting for the right time to emerge. Together, the trio had gone from fugitives to historians, from doubted to revered. But the journey had changed them. They had seen how easily history could be misunderstood, how symbols could be twisted, and how fear could overwrite facts. Ben, now often asked to comment on historical matters, never positioned himself as an expert. "I'm just a guy who followed the clues," he would say with a smile. But behind that humility was someone who had risked everything for something that could never be held in his hands, only in his heart: truth. Theirs was not a story of fortune, but of finding meaning in the places most overlook. And while the world moved on, the legend they unearthed continued to echo quietly through time. In the months that followed, Ben received letters from all over the world, from students, professors, historians, and curious minds who had watched the televised announcements or read Riley's book. Many asked about the treasure, but more surprisingly, most asked about the Freemasons. People wanted to know if they were evil, if the eye on the dollar was a sinister sign, or if secret societies truly held the reins of power. Ben answered carefully, always mindful of how myth and truth intertwine. He explained that while the Masons were certainly influential in many points of history, they were never the puppeteers that conspiracy theorists imagined. Their rituals, symbols, and secrecy weren't evidence of evil, but of tradition, reflection, and caution, a response to centuries when knowledge could cost a man his life. And yes, there were those who misused that heritage, just as people have misused religion, science, and politics. But to judge an entire movement by the actions of a few is to miss the bigger picture. He reminded readers that the eye, above the pyramid, the so-called all-seeing eye, was not born in darkness. It came from ancient Egypt as a symbol of protection and vision, then passed through Christian imagery as a representation of divine providence, and finally was adopted by Freemasonry as a symbol of knowledge guided by higher principles. The Founding Fathers didn't add it to the dollar bill to signal a hidden agenda. They added it to reflect a belief that even a young, flawed nation could strive toward something greater, watched over not by a king, but by conscience. Still, Ben understood why people were drawn to darker interpretations. Mystery is magnetic. When the truth is complicated, some prefer the simplicity of a story where everything is controlled by a shadowy few. It provides a sense of order in a chaotic world, even if that order is imagined. That's why conspiracy theories persist, he realized. They don't just explain the world, they validate feelings of powerlessness. But Ben had seen what real power looked like, and it wasn't hidden behind curtains or conducted in secret basements. It was knowledge. It was resilience. It was the courage to seek truth when the answers might shake your beliefs. One night, as he stood at the edge of the estate he now called home, he looked up at the stars and thought of his grandfather, the man who had planted the seed, who had refused to let the family legacy become a punchline. And now, here he was, not a treasure hunter, not a thief, not a lunatic, but a man who had honored a promise. Riley joined him, beer in hand, and asked, "So, what's next?" Ben smiled, letting the question hang in the cool night air. The world was full of riddles, full of symbols waiting to be understood. Maybe they'd chase another one. Or maybe, for once, they'd rest. "For now," Ben said, "we've earned a break." And in the silence that followed, the weight of centuries seemed to lift, leaving behind nothing but peace, and the echo of a story that would be told for generations. But history, as Ben well knew, never truly rests. Just weeks after the treasure's discovery became public knowledge, obscure corners of the internet lit up with theories. Some claimed the treasure had already been looted long ago, and what Ben found was a decoy. Others insisted that the Freemasons had allowed him to find it as part of a much larger orchestrated plan. Some posts even accused Ben of becoming part of the very system he once seemed to defy. It didn't bother him. He had learned that people see what they want to see. Symbols of knowledge become symbols of control, and wisdom is often mistaken for manipulation. But those closest to him knew better. They had seen him put his life at risk, not for gold, but to protect a piece of history that belonged to everyone. In many ways, the treasure wasn't the climax of the story, but its preface. The real journey was internal. Ben's transformation from a man obsessed with proving his family right into someone who no longer needed proof. His actions had transcended doubt. He no longer sought validation. He had become the kind of man whose legacy was no longer a rumor, but a record. As for the Masons, Ben never joined them, though he was once invited. He said he didn't need a ring to honor their values. Truth, service, and the pursuit of knowledge, those weren't exclusive to any order. They were open to all who chose to live with integrity, and that was the ultimate treasure. Not the relics, not the scrolls, not the halls lined with gold and marble, but the realization that what we inherit isn't just material. It's the courage to question, the discipline to learn, the patience to understand, and above all, the strength to act on what we believe, even when no one else does. That's what the Gates family had passed down quietly for generations. A legacy not of wealth, but of wonder. The Freemasons, for all their secrecy and misunderstood symbols, had stood for something similar at their best: enlightenment, unity, and the belief that progress begins within. And now, standing at the threshold between myth and history, Ben carried that torch forward, not to protect a vault, but to illuminate the path for others. As the world debated whether the treasure was real or the Freemasons still held power, Ben simply smiled. Some truths don't need defending, they just need living. Riley went on to teach historical cryptology. Abigail continued her work in cultural preservation. And Ben, well, he remained curious. Somewhere in his study, under a lock that only he and Abigail knew, rested the worn pipe that had started it all. Not because he needed it, but because it reminded him that the past, when seen clearly, doesn't just tell us who we were. It guides us toward who we can still become. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of this journey? Do you believe the Freemasons are hiding more than they reveal? Or are we just seeing what we want to see? Drop a comment. Below, I'll be reading all of them. Your feedback helps a lot.